run all the tech myself. Yeah! Millennial power, be with me. So today's sermon is based off of this little book. I read it in a couple hours, so if you want to read one, I can attest it only takes a couple hours to read through. And my hope is that the sermon doesn't play like a book report, especially not like a junior high book report. But I thought I would just go kind of straight from the book, because why reinvent the wheel? He did such a great job that I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights, and it should be really fun. There's an ancient tradition in India and the Himalayan regions where they do this thing. It's called a reading transmission, where if you're going to learn to study the Yoga Sutra, or you're going to become a teacher of the Bhagavad Gita, they'll do this thing where you sit down with the guru, and the guru doesn't explain anything, they just read it through. Right? So they just start, Atha Yoga Anushasana, blah, 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 and they just read the thing to you. And the idea is that, as I think some of us have found, there's something different that happens between when we sit there and try to cognitively and visually digest something versus when we receive it auditorily. They say it's like some subtle vibration. You don't have to believe in that or not, because maybe something comes through kinesthetically, through reading body language or through hearing tone of voice. And then something happens when we engage with a teaching, with a piece of knowledge in community. Something happens, we're engaging a different line of intelligence when we do it together than when we do it alone at home. Not Home Alone, which you may watch during the holiday season. So we're gonna play like that. And to make it even more fun, what I hope is that at the end, we'll have gone through this information, and then maybe something will have stood out for you, and we can have a little discussion. You can report back, oh, I think I'm going to do this, or this stood out because that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, or I got nothing from that sermon, but while I was daydreaming, I thought of this. And then we can all learn from you, and it'll be quite a good time. So shall we dive right in?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, and I'm still recording.
We don't have any water. How are we going to do that?
We're going to dive into the ocean of knowledge, my good man. That's a good response. Okay, so the first, like book report style. So the first thing, this is Bill McKibben. Do you know who Bill McKibben is? Bill McKibben is a famous environmentalist. I find him articulate. He's just one of the best environmental apologists of our time. What's cool about this book is that I expected it to be quite environmental in thrust, and maybe it's just because it was written in '98 and some of us weren't feeling quite the degree of urgency that we're feeling now. But mostly it talks about spiritual and familial things rather than the environmental impacts of our Christmas. But in any event, really cool. So the first thing he talks about is, I'll read you a little quote because it's just so good. Introduction. Who stole Christmas? I've been called my share of names, but the only one that ever really stung was Grinch. This $100 Holidays campaign was started as a set of teachings and sermons that they gave in their churches to try to bring back some more, maybe not the whole war on Christmas, kind of bring back the reason for the season, but a little bit about kind of modern liberal Christians trying to figure out, like, why exactly do we do what we do at the holidays, and how can we make it more an expression of our values than maybe just a rote performance that kind of stresses everybody out. So they started giving these sermons called $100 Holidays, and some op-ed writers decided that he was a Grinch. He was stealing the spirit of Christmas. And so I really love this. As a person who feels a little Grinchy sometimes, I'm sorry, I should just admit that out in the front in case my bias comes through. I've tried to hold it completely in reserve for this sermon. But what happened is he was called a Grinch, and so he said, okay, I'm going to go look through all of my kids' Dr. Seuss books and find out if this is really true. You know, maybe I am a Grinch. And so he says, he read through Green Eggs and Ham and flipped past Horton Hears a Who and found the Grinch. And was reading through there and came to the part where the Grinch said, oh, because this is a sacred text to me, how the Grinch who stole how the Grinch stole Christmas? How. And the Grinch says, from the top of his malevolent mountain, "Why, for 53 years I've put up with it now. I must stop this Christmas from coming. But how?" So, as you know the story, the Grinch comes, spoiler alert, in case you haven't ever read this one, but he comes down and he steals all the presents and he goes backwards up the chimney, and then he's dressed as Santa and he tells little Cindy Lou, who I think it is, "Oh no, these presents are defective and I've got to take them back." And he effectively steals Christmas. But, as you know, at near the end of the book, he's sitting on his malevolent mountain, the sun comes up, it's Christmas morning, he's expecting wails of sorrow and the beating of breasts, and instead he hears
Singing.
Whoa, you guys are good who's. Man. That's right, and he exclaims this famous line, "It came without ribbons, it came without tags, it came without packages, boxes, or bags." And then after puzzling 3 hours till his puzzler was sore, the Grinch was forced to conclude that Christmas couldn't come from the store. And then, like many of us, his heart grew 3 sizes that day. It's a really great story. So Bill McKibben found through his research that he was not actually a Grinch, because what he was trying to teach people was that Christmas is not something bought in a store. And I am part, I'll also out myself, I am part of the war on Christmas. I gave a sermon last week that highlighted Christian dominance as a form of privilege in our country, but rather than say holidays or Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, I'm just going to say Christmas for the sermon, and I hope you don't mind too terribly. So Christmas, etc., is something that can't come from a store. And this is the idea of this book. So he also writes, which I found really beautiful, the notion, we should just say up front, is it's not some strange austerity measures for the household. We're going to cap Christmas at $100. We're not going to increase the Christmas deficit. This goes no further, not on my watch. No, the idea is about getting into some deeper spiritual or heart-centered root. And so he writes, "This book and the church campaign that grows out of it is not an exercise in nostalgia, a search for some perfect and uncorrupted Christmas in the past to which we can return. Christmas has been and always will be a product of its time, shaped to fit the particular needs of people, society, and faith in particular moments of history, and nowhere is that clearer than at the very beginning." So, what he's talking about is a way to utilize the holiday season, a way to sort of kind of turn on its head what we've been doing, because the idea was that these holidays are meant to serve people. They're meant to serve families. They're meant to serve faith. They're meant to serve individuals. And sometimes, maybe you're like really enlightened and you haven't had to deal with this, but have you ever had this experience that like you're in service of Christmas? Like old Saint Nick is like slave driving you around. Like, wait, we forgot the cousins on your mom's side. Oh, what are we gonna do? What do we get them? And then they're okay. The negotiation battle between your family and the in-laws' family, right? Or perhaps like you don't have a surplus of families. Maybe you don't have a family to visit at Christmas, and yet culture is telling you that there must be something wrong with you, and don't you feel terribly lonely because all the beautiful meaning. And so it's kind of like there's this entity out there that we're attempting with all of our might to serve correctly, rather than having the thing be something that brings fulfillment to us. So this is the idea. It's not about $100. It's not about all of the anti-consumerist rhetoric that I'm about to give you. It's about you tapping into the power of holiday celebration, the power of celebrating something holy with community, with loved ones, and letting that be something that feeds and nourishes our spirit rather than something which is spirit draining. Okay, so then he said at the beginning. So what I really like, the next chapter in our book, is where does Christmas come from? And this is really cool. I bet some of you already know. So, class, what do you think? What are some origins? Where does Christmas come from? And don't say the heart. I just said that. That's a cheating answer. The history of Christmas. Okay, the winter solstice. The winter solstice, right? These ancient Yule celebrations that we'll talk about in a second. What else? Other ideas? Yeah?
I think Santa came from like Mongolian shamans.
Quite possibly, yeah. My ornament I always put up is this little, somebody gave me a little Amanita muscaria mushroom. That's the magic kind. I don't eat them, by the way, just in case you were wondering. I would be okay with myself if I did, just to be clear. But one theory is that the red and white mushroom is where a lot of the red and white mythic symbolism. We don't know what Santa actually wears because you can't see him.
Probably doesn't wear mushrooms.
No, but he's supposed to wear this red and white suit, right? And so they say that might, and they say this mushroom, it releases chemicals in your brain, and the ancient shamans felt that those cascaded down through this subtle spiritual network, and so this is Santa descending the chimney and distributing his gifts of colored lights and just,
Whoa.
I don't know. So that's just an idea, yeah.
And they hallucinated that the deer were flying.
Right? I heard that one in a Cheech and Chong skit. It's a little more magic dust for the reindeers. So there might be some Siberian shamanism in there. There might be some winter solstice stuff, right? And then we don't know when Jesus was born, like to the date. So they said, why not just put it in December? The other good dates are taken. Okay, so there's a Jesus part. The festival. One new thing that I learned was the way they frame the festival of Yule. So this is this solstice-tide celebration. And if you're living in Europe, like this Germanic, these are largely, this lit-up tree is a Germanic, maybe Dutch tradition that came to America. And if you're living in these regions, in the olden days, this interesting thing happens. You have raised livestock throughout the year that you're going to eat when your beans and barley and stuff are not growing during the winter. But you can't butcher them until the weather is cold enough that they won't rot. Right? And then later, it all has to be salted and packed away. And then you've got, right around this time of year, the grains that you harvested back at Lughnasadh in the beginning of August, and then again, throughout the season, those first grain harvests have been fermenting since around August. And so you've got the first harvest of really strong German beer. And so what in the ancient world makes a great party? Fresh livestock and strong beer. And then it's the darkest night of the year. Let's build a bonfire, you guys. Come on. And this is a pretty cool party, I think. Right? So we've got this ancient tradition of whoa. And here's the thing that he says, which comes back to this idea that Christmas should be something that feeds our spirit, is that in the ancient days, this was the one break between the harvest and the butchering and the preparation and the fermenting and the salting and all the things. And then in a couple of months, the planting and the things and the hoeing and the weeding and the composting and so you get this little dark piece of December where you can build a campfire, crack open a brewski, and hang out with your fam. So this is what's cool. This is the origin of Christmas. Then, obviously, the Christians didn't like this very much. So there was this back and forth battle, really kind of interesting, between let's get rid of Christmas. What's less reserved and Christ-like than having a bonfire rager on the darkest night of the year with all your buddies, right? So we got to settle this down if Christendom is going to spread the light of peace throughout the world. And then there's the other camp that says, wait a minute, we're never going to convert the pagans unless we make their holidays into our holidays. Yeah, so you have this really interesting thing, like for the past 1800 years or something, 1600 years or something like that, you've got this Christmas kind of going back and forth, like we see now, right? If you get really fundamentalist Christians, like the real hardcore ones, it's like, no tree, no presents. These are pagan things. And then you get everybody else, which is like, if you don't put up a Christmas tree, you're a Satanist. And it's like from the outside, from the outside of mainstream Christendom, that's so weird that discussion would be happening. And yet, historically, you can see this discussion has toggled back and forth for thousands of years. So wild. Okay, so those are some old traditional roots. Then you have wassailing. Isn't there a song, something, wassailing? Okay, good. I'm so glad you guys sat right in front too. This is excellent. So, do you know about this tradition? What is wassailing? And the ale in wassailing is important, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. Well, one tradition is like you would make this big pot of alcoholic beverage, and this was your ale, and then everybody would drink it and kind of stagger around, I think. But there was another, Merry Christmas. There was another tradition of wassailing where young, working class, poorish folk on one night a year would there's this terrible movie I never watched, but I saw the previews for The Purge, right? And it's like this dystopian future where they suspend all the laws for the night because the wealthy ruling class realizes that the ancient Romans, you need a crazy festival once a year to keep the people in line or something like that. So this is kind of what the wassail tradition was about. One night of the year, the poor take their rich employers to task, and they could knock on they would literally go around knocking on the door, and they would make the wealthy business owners give them fine wines and a roast beef dinner, or they would beat them up. Yeah, so yeah, it's the Christmas trick-or-treating, and totally weird and amazing. So this is one of our strange and interesting Christmas traditions. Then when the Puritans came to America, America didn't have Christmas for quite a long time. Early 1800s starting to mid 1800s is when Christmas started in this country. Before that, our Puritan forebears outlawed Christmas celebrations because mostly it was about eating meat and drinking wine and then pounding on landholders' doors and making them give you stuff where you beat them up. And they said, this is not good for society. I'm pretty sure this is not a great thing. But the tradition, as Puritanism lost its hold, and then more German folk came and immigrated, Christmas re-emerged. It's a very winter solstice symbolism there. It goes underground for a while, then it re-emerges, and it goes underground for a while, and then it re-emerges. So by the early 1800s, we have this interesting thing. Christmas as a notion has come back around, but mostly in the big cities, it's the tradition of ruffian working class people running amok on the streets, highly intoxicated and causing trouble. So I didn't fact check all of this, but the way, because I know McKibben's bias, so we should check him, but the way he writes it is that the wealthy class said, we're going to have to do something about this ruffians running amok on Christmas tradition. And one way that was dealt with was beginning to create a different Christmas tradition that could overtake the ruffian version. And so, did you know, now we're not going to debate anything about Santa Claus today. We know there was a Turkish saint, Saint Nicholas, and he was somehow related, and we know some other things, but we'll table that discussion. But did you know that America didn't have a tradition of Santa Claus until that famous "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" story? We didn't do any Santa Claus stuff until I think the original title was A Visit from St. Nick or something like that. So that was the start of it. And slowly but surely, this notion that the jolly old elf was coming to our house and all the things. You know, maybe people started putting out the cookies, and so Santa Claus took notice of America finally. Before it was like, oh, it's all just ruffians and Puritans. They don't want me. We started to have this tradition that gifts would come, and you know, we would read that story, and slowly but surely, people like Mr. Woolworth got a clue and started running these amazing sales. Christmas Eve stores, like in the 1800s, would stay open until midnight on Christmas Eve. And confectioners would make special Christmas candies, and all of this kind of cool stuff was going on. One of the later iterations, do you guys remember that Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, I think is a claymation? 1950 something, probably 60, early 60s, 63. Let's guess. That was made by Montgomery Ward. So always interesting to note, like, who are the sponsors of such things? Who sponsored this climate science? Oh, it was ExxonMobil. Interesting. Who sponsored Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? Oh, it was a store. How interesting. Because it's advertising. It's creating a certain type of Christmas, a certain notion of Christmas that we've all bought into so deeply that if Starbucks changes their cups, the whole thing could crumble. You don't drink, so you don't have to worry about it. No, but some people are really concerned. Some people who don't drink Starbucks either are very concerned with what those cups look like. I still haven't quite figured out why. Yeah.
That's a whole different myth.
So, in our textbook, what's the title of this book? The Battle for Christmas by a guy named Nissenbaum. In a way, writes Nissenbaum, the new celebration of Christmas served as a way to educate Americans, traditionally distrustful of luxury and excess, to the joys of buying things they didn't strictly need. It was the thin edge of the wedge by which many Americans became enmeshed in the more self-indulgent aspects of consumer spending, a crucial means of legitimizing the penetration of consumerist behavior into American society. How cool. There's also a fortunate occurrence of the end of World War I, and people not quite knowing what we were going to do to have an economy. All this productive capacity. So if we don't get people to buy, how do we run the American economy in this new industrial age? Really just kind of wild stuff. So that's where, and then, last history piece, I thought really cool, the Christmas tree. Do you know who introduced that? I didn't memorize their name, but it was a Unitarian. So you can thank the Unitarians for the Christmas tree. This was a German-born Unitarian, and one thing about Unitarians at that time was they were very interested in raising up children right, kind of like we are, like peacemakers and justice-oriented, like kind, non-selfish, good people. And they started to see the greed for Christmas presents, right? Probably not, none of you were like this as children. None of you are probably like this now. But you may have seen, on a movie or something like that, kids that, I want this and I want that and I want that. The Unitarians were very concerned about what Christmas would do to children's behavior. Are we encouraging greed and self-indulgence? So, low battery. Well, it's the only...
It's all the greed and self-indulgence.
I know, it's just sucking the power right out of it. This is the only slide I have, though, so if you just miss Ben Franklin Claus. What time is it? Oh, we might just make it. We've only got a few minutes left. So, he introduced the idea that the presents go under the tree, and the tree and the presents themselves are unveiled at Christmas Day. So you open the door and there's this flame, like it's a tree with candles. I don't recommend this, but there's this blazing evergreen tree, and then there's all of these presents. But before that, you don't get to clamor for I want this and I want that and know what they're. It's like it's a big surprise, And so the Unitarians thought this, oh, that's a great idea. It caught on, but unfortunately it didn't reduce materialism. It just added a flaming tree to the American Christmas tradition. Okay, so this is just a fun, I found this to be a really fun romp through the history of Christmas, because we get so many ideas, like, many cultures, we take what's been done and what's been said and we assume it's sort of always been that way. And then when we look, like, some of these things have not been that way for very long. Some of them are not originated from the places we thought they were originated. And just taking a little glance at that, I find it really refreshing. It's like some sort of bondage is released. So then we have where we are today. What's the problem, says our author? What are the problems peculiar to the moment that we might help ease by changing some of the ways we celebrate this greatest of national festivals? He says the reason to change Christmas, the reason it might be useful to change Christmas, is because it might help us get at some of the underlying discontent in our lives. It might help us to see how to change every other day in the year in ways that really would make our whole lives, and maybe our entire 365 days a year culture, healthier in the long run. So I really enjoy, like I said, he doesn't harp on the environmental side of things. Although, if you're environmentally inclined at all, like myself, I see the wrapping paper river, like even in Santa Cruz, like people mostly by hippies and college students who can't afford anything. And the day after Christmas, onslaught of garbage upon garbage, it kind of breaks my heart. And so, I don't think I need to preach to you about, well, wrap in paper bags and recycle the things, because you already know this. But what he proposes is that, putting that aside for just a moment, the idea that we're sold, that we're using Christmas because all of this consumption, right? All of this, we're going to eat the fine foods and the strong beer like our ancestors did, and then we're going to give each other gifts, and then somehow this is going to be fulfilling to us. Somehow it's going to make the trials and the stresses of our lives a little bit easier to bear. And for some of us that probably actually works, right? But if you're working all week and then you have kids or other family, and then you also have to do Christmas, it can be a little draining. So the notion he presents is to take a look at, do the ways we try to get fulfillment really bring us fulfillment? And to take a page from this ancient festival, that it was a festival of rest. It was a pause between the intense activities that we have to undertake to survive. So this, more than anything, he says, don't get caught up on the $100. Maybe to make Christmas really work for your family, you need to do a $500 Christmas. Or maybe everybody brings a potluck and you do a $5 Christmas. The idea is not to get caught up in how much are we spending, but to get really caught up in how much are we receiving. How much are we resting? How much are we being nourished? How much are we sharing together? And to utilize this time of checking in, what do we actually need in life? And how can we serve that for each other? So, there were a few ideas that he presents. We're running short on time. I always am more loquacious than I thought. He suggests taking your family out and doing the St. Francis tradition, where St. Francis invites us to scatter grains for the birds and the beasts so they get a day off from having to work so hard to survive. He mentions what I do, the idea of giving gift exemptions. You don't have to buy me a Christmas present. In fact, by giving you this recycled piece of paper, I state that I would prefer that you don't buy me a Christmas present, and that we find other ways to honor each other. He suggests things like, rather than an uncle or an aunt giving the child a toy dinosaur or a book about dinosaurs, give them a trip to the museum. and spend time together learning about dinosaurs. Because really, how much more room do you have on that kid's bookshelf or toy box? Finally, he addresses the issue of what will happen to the economy if we don't spend for Christmas. And I really like, he fires back, that goes against all the rhetoric of how a free market economy, like if it's dependent on one day of the year, everyone buying things that they don't need, how weak of a system is that? But at the same time, all this money and time that you save doesn't just, stay in, it might just stay in the bank, but this is money that can be given to people who actually need it. I'm very inspired by the story of the Magi, who they didn't sit in their astrological tower as, oh, I see the Christ is born. Let's have a few drinks and give each other gifts. They got on their camels and they went and they found a Palestinian refugee family that couldn't even stay in an inn for a night, and they gave the most precious things to them. If we need anything, I think we need to take a look at if we're really fed by the idea of constant consumption. Are we really fed by giving our children the idea of constant consumption? Most Americans, while we have much more in this day and age, report that our happiness is lower than ever before. Most of us report only 19% of Americans said they'd like a more exciting life, where 70% or so said they'd like more peace and quiet. So my invitation to you, if you, don't like tax plans that give away things solely to people who have a residence in the Virgin Islands and own a business, is maybe learn to make a holiday that's less about consumption and more about nourishment. That's less about excitement and more about rest. That takes this idea of family and spirit and values and quiet and holds that at the center rather than the rituals of the religion of consumerism, our culture, that we've been told we have to do right or there's something wrong with us. So I promised a discussion and then I used up all of our time. So I would encourage you to stay for coffee hour. And here's your topic. What, if anything, inspired you from this sermon? What counter-inspired you? You can just tell that to me and I'll smile through your critique. And what ideas do you have to make this a unique and nourishing holiday season? So with that, let's stand together and we'll sing our final benediction to each other. If you could take the hand or shoulder of someone nearby.